What can we expect in foreign policy with Joe Biden as president? Join Richard Ebeling and me and special guest Doug Bandow in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we address that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle. The show, as many of you know, brings you the principled case for libertarianism, and I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, along with a special guest. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you and to be seeing our special guest there.
Yeah, we got Doug Bandow from the Cato Institute. Doug, great to see you again.
Hey, good to see both of you all. It's been a long time.
Yeah. Doug is senior fellow at Cato and just a prolific writer and one of the greatest libertarians in our time. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here, Doug. I thought we would talk mostly about foreign policy. It's something that you have concentrated a lot of your work on, but of course you write on just about every aspect of libertarianism and have for many, many years. But with the Biden administration coming in, I thought, well, this is a nice opportunity to get your perspective as to whether we're going to see any changes here, whether there's any optimism at all compared to what's been going on before us. So why don't you give us your assessment of how you see things now with the Biden administration?
Well, of course, Biden has been with us for almost a half century. I mean, this is not some new idealistic liberal showing up. This is a man who spent his third presidential campaign. Unique circumstances are going to put him in the White House. If you look at the policy under Obama, I think there's at least a starting point of analysis. As far as we can tell, there weren't a lot of differences between Biden and Obama. Obama was a bit more hawkish, say, on something like Afghanistan, that Biden apparently opposed putting extra troops in. But it's not clear that he opposed much else. After Libya turned out to be a disaster, Biden declared that he'd been against it, which is a very convenient position to be in. He voted for the Iraq War, seemed to have some regrets. Who doesn't? I mean, how could you not regret that disaster? He certainly appears to be a very standard liberal interventionist. He loves the alliances. He wants to kiss and make up with the Europeans. He's made that very clear. He wrote an article and told the South Koreans, don't worry, I would never threaten to bring the troops home. On the Middle East, he's a fairly standard guy, very pro-Israel, just not kind of off the charts the way that Trump was. The one area that I think there may be progress on would be Iran, where he was very supportive of the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. It was not in favor of sanctions coming in. He talked about rejoining the agreement, which presumably would mean the sanctions would come off. Not clear what he'd do on some of the other cases. Cuba, presumably he would go back to the Obama policy again. We don't know for sure. There are people around him who've talked about Iran saying, well, this is a great opportunity. Let's use the Trump sanctions as leverage to get a better deal, which, of course, was the Trump program. I mean, Trump told us he was putting sanctions on to get a better deal. Maybe that would be the case on Cuba. I mean, I have some hope, at least in those cases, and Venezuela as well. But we shouldn't expect a lot of change. The people he's talking about as being around him, Blinken, Michelle Flournoy as defense secretary, these are all pretty standard interventionists. These are not people who've ever suggested that philosophically or in principle there's a problem with American intervention. Every once in a while they admit it doesn't work. But beyond that, I think we've got a fairly standard liberal here, and I would expect a foreign policy of kind of doing everything for everyone, may be tempered by the fact the U.S. government's bankrupt. At some point, I presume that'll have an impact on his policies, but up front, he's not talking about that.
Well, let me sort of ask you this, Doug. It's clear from a lot of the spokesmen for other governments that we've had a difficult and traumatic time for the last 4 years with Trump on foreign policy. We need healing. We need to restore the international liberal order that grew out of World War II and assured so much peace and tranquility and harmony among so many nations, even in the adversarial time of the Cold War. And that Trump wanted to destroy this by just being for America first and do it alone. And well, all that Biden is offering is a joining together on global security, on climate change, the World Health Organization. We're rejoining the world, Doug, for peace and harmony and healing. What is wrong with that?
Well, of course, it's a great system if you're the other countries, because, of course, that means we do everything for you. We pay for you, we defend you, we protect you. And that's clearly what other countries want. And I don't blame them. I mean, I think that the critical thing here is to recognize the U.S. has created extraordinary incentives, which is we promise to defend you. And even if you don't want to defend yourself, we send people over to reassure you that we'll defend you. And we put troops in your country and we'll defend you. I mean, it's a great system. So from the standpoint of other countries, no surprise, they like this. And look, you could certainly argue that in 1945, the world required some institutions. It's hard to argue that we need them today. And to me, that's the problem with, kind of the liberal interventionist argument is for them, whatever has been must ever be. Anything good in the world obviously occurred because the U.S. intervened and created it. And it's pretty hard to make that case today. I mean, to my mind is look at the last 20 years in the Middle East. I mean, has there been a more disastrous policy by any government? People on the right get frustrated when I point out the fact that, actually we're the most militaristic country on earth. We've intervened more often in more countries. We frankly created more disasters than one can imagine. And it strikes me that's objectively true. And, the Europeans, for example, want us to intervene, but they want to be able to tell us when to intervene. They don't want us to order them around. They want to be able to order us around and make us feel guilty. So we want free trade. Of course, the question of whether these international institutions we've created give us free trade is a very different question. And how well do the WTO and other things work? But the big problem are the alliances, that these are the areas that bring us into military intervention. And that's where we had so much problem. And when they talk about keeping this wonderful liberal international order, that's what they mean. And you can read American interventionists. They say exactly the same thing. There's a new book out arguing how the alliances are fabulous and amazing and great, and they extend our power, and how could anybody oppose them, that kind of a thing. And that's what they're really talking about.
Well, if I can just follow up with that, you said the U.S. has been the biggest, intervener on the international scene. But that would be like saying that a surgeon has cut more people open with his scalpel than the worst serial killer slashing with a knife. That's the surgeon's job. And certainly what America has done in these decades is offer this cohesion. For example, if we pull back, what happens to Taiwan? Clearly, China wants to maybe militarily reclaim that island. And don't we have certain historical and certain mutual government agreements about this? Are we to allow that to just fall behind what used to be known as the bamboo curtain?
Well, the problem here is that if you want a surgeon, presumably you'd like a competent surgeon. So if you look at America's military performance, since World War II, it's pretty hard to get excited about it. I mean, Korea ended up in a stalemate. I mean, the problem there for us was that we decided to liberate North Korea. It sounded like a great idea, but the Chinese weren't interested. And then, the war went on for another 2.5 years, a bloody, terrible, awful thing, which we're still living with today. And then, of course, look at Vietnam, but particularly look at the last 20 years. That scalpel has been wielded, shall we say, with not much care. I mean, the challenge of international relations, of course, is there are lots of things that we want and which would be good and would be wonderful. The question is, how much are we willing to spend to achieve them? How much are we willing to risk to achieve them? I mean, Taiwan, frankly, is a wonderful place. They deserve to have their own country. They shouldn't be swallowed by China. But are we prepared for a nuclear war over Taiwan, to defend their right to be independent? And I tell people, visualize China defending Cuba against America. That's what it means to defend Taiwan. And I think that's where we have to ask. Now, my view is that maybe the Taiwanese should have nuclear weapons. I mean, there are lots of things you can talk about what the Taiwanese should do. They actually spend only a couple % of their GDP on the military. It's quite extraordinary. If they're really worried about the Chinese swooping in and taking them over, the question is, why don't they do more? It's pretty clear they expect us to do it for them. Well, that's not a very good position for us to be in. And I think we face that in terms of the other countries. The good news is most of our other allies and friends are much abler to defend themselves. I mean, the South Koreans have 50 times the GDP of North Korea. Explain to me again why we have troops there. Europeans have 11 times Russia's GDP. Why again do we have troops there? But we have to ask the very fundamental question, what's the purpose of the U.S. government? Who should it be defending? What risks should we take? And what costs should we undertake? The cost is basically, extending power. I mean, the problem is it's not very costly to deter. It's very expensive if we want to kind of overcome them in their own neighborhood. We have 11 carrier groups. Those are really expensive. The Chinese don't need 11 carrier groups. All they need is the capacity to sink our carriers. And that means missiles and torpedoes. It's a lot cheaper to do that than it is to build a new carrier and explain to the American people why 6,000 sailors just went to their deaths, at the bottom of the ocean. So we have, an extraordinary burden here to try to project power everywhere. And what I tell people, our foreign policy could be summed up as the Monroe Doctrine applied to the entire world. That is, we are entitled to intervene everywhere. Nobody anywhere has any right to intervene unless we say so. And that sounds great, but it's rather expensive to enforce. We find that against Russia. We're going to intervene in Ukraine, Georgia, against them. We're going to intervene against the Chinese right next door in a territory that was historically theirs. That strikes me as being a burden beyond that the U.S. government should partake of, especially given the interests of the American people, who the U.S. government is supposed to be protecting.
Well, let me follow through this a little bit more, if I may. My first challenges to you, I realize, were perhaps somewhat rhetorically sarcastic, but there are serious issues in which people debate. Now, you were saying that America should be concerned about its overreach with alliances. Now, that raises the legitimate question, is that what is involved in the proper national defense of the United States? Does that preclude any defensive alliances with other nations? And if it does, in principle, permit it in theory, then how does one decide which alliances, when, and how?
I think that foreign policy tends to be quite prudential and practical in that sense. I think that one could make an argument that in 1950, a NATO alliance made sense until the Europeans recovered. That we didn't know for sure where Stalin's ambitions were. He'd swallowed up Eastern and Central Europe. That was a moment to say, boy, Western Europe is a complete wreck. So let's stand there and let them defend themselves. It's pretty hard to make that case in 2020. And to me, that's one reason why you want to say your foreign policy changes with circumstances. I wouldn't say that you could never intervene abroad for national interests. That is, the question is what's required for our national security. At what point do you perceive a threat of somebody perhaps dominating Eurasia? And what would that mean for the U.S. versus what we do today in a world which is vastly different? And my complaint is that coming out of World War II was a unique set of threats, a unique set of problems. But the institutions we created then have essentially no relevance to a world that's 75 years later. And let's recognize how easy it is to fall into choice, which is those institutions themselves have their own interests. In 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. 1992, the Soviet Union as well as Warsaw Pact are gone. Do you need NATO? Well, NATO started planning what it was needed for. It came up with new duties. They were even talking about promoting student exchanges, fighting the drug war. And then they decided on out-of-area activities. So it's no longer Europe we worry about. We're going to go to war somewhere else. So you saw the self-interest of an institution take over. And then you see the incentives for the Europeans. If Europe's under threat, why do the Germans spend only 1.4% of GDP on the military? Why do the Baltic states, which are viewed as most at risk, spend only 2%? I mean, if you're really afraid that you're going to be overrun, shouldn't you spend a little bit more? Shouldn't you be taking steps to be what we call a porcupine defense? Make it clear that if you attack us, you're going to pay a high price. Instead, they all expect us to take care of them. So my view here is that we don't have to be doctrinaire and say, no, 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 never, ever, ever can an American service personnel operate anywhere overseas. My argument is you have a very tough burden of proof. You have to demonstrate that it's in America's fundamental interests, which means protecting America. It means protecting American citizens, our liberties, our territory, and that it's really related to that, that it's critical, that it's important, that you don't just make the statement how vital something is. Today, everybody declares everything to be vital. I mean, Africa is vital, everywhere in Asia is vital. I mean, every country anywhere is vital. Suddenly we find out the Philippines is vital, everything's vital. Well, that's silly. That's simply not the case. So my reaction is you have to make the case, and especially if you want to go to war. The cost of war is huge. It almost always turns out worse than we expect. People die in it. We've seen the wars in other countries. The wars we've gotten into, nobody expected Vietnam to go on the way it was. I mean, you look at some of the wars other countries have started. I mean, Yemen, which were helping Saudi Arabians commit war for no obvious purpose. They went to war 5 years ago, assuming it'd be 5 weeks. 5 years later, they're still into it. So I think there's a huge burden of proof for anybody who argues for military intervention, argues for alliances, argues for those kinds of involvement. Experience tells us they rarely turn out well, and they turn out very badly for those who go into combat. You need to come up with a really solid proof here. We certainly haven't seen that in any of the wars of the last 20 years. I mean, they're essentially frivolous, except for those who are involved, and then the consequences are catastrophic.
Well, let me put things in a broad historical context where you can help me out, Doug. I recently read an article that said that with Trump gone, we're going to be able to end America's system of isolationism. And that's interesting. If he considers what we're living under isolationism, what would he consider a truly non-interventionist foreign policy, which was the founding policy of America? I mean, if you go back, Quincy Adams' famous speech, 4th of July, 1821, In Search of Monsters to Destroy. He said that this is not a nation that's going to be doing that. They're going to be going abroad, knocking out all these bad things. There's dictators, there's civil wars, there's revolutions, there's wars between nation states, famines. There's all kinds of bad things. But the U.S. would not be sending forces abroad to help people out. And interestingly enough, they had a system of open immigration. Hey, if you're suffering any of those bad things, you can get out. You can come here, and we will not forcibly return you to your country of origin. That system was combined, of course, with a limited government republic. There was no national security state for the first 150 years, no CIA, no NSA, no Pentagon, no giant military establishment. There was a basic military, but certainly not enough to go abroad and intervene in Europe's wars or Asia's wars, large enough to maybe fight the Mexican War, but not large enough to engage in World War I or World War II. And everything changed. And I think a lot of Americans don't realize that. They think that we've lived under the same system for the whole history of the United States. And they see all this interventionism. They may be a little bit confused about it. Maybe they think, well, things haven't worked out. But they don't understand philosophically what's involved here is that you're really looking at two different paradigms. One that is oriented and based on non-interventionism, and one that goes abroad with the affirmative duty of righting the wrongs of the world. What do you think?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that a good starting point is the farewell address by Washington. When you read it, apply it to today. We shouldn't have these permanent entanglements. We're a commercial republic. We should do business with all. We should be friendly with all. And I look at the Middle East and I say, why do we have permanent entanglements with both Israel and Saudi Arabia? I mean, the point is you can have friendly relations, go for it. But why do we have these military relationships that get us into wars? I mean, you look at his reasoning today, and he was looking especially at Europe, all the conflict of the old world. I mean, European history was constant wars. We're a colony of Great Britain, so if France and Great Britain go to war, we go to war because there's, the French had at that point Canada, and have their territory, and the British want to fight them. So America's dragged into it. His argument, we shouldn't be a make-weight. We shouldn't be dragged into these things. So he had a very clear vision. Let's be a commercial republic. Let's, not have those, permanent alliances. And his view, you may need to country in a dangerous world, maybe we need to ally with somebody at some point, but that would be temporary. It'd be circumstance-based. It would be based on our national interest and focused on North America. And you're quite right. I mean, you look at something like the Mexican-American War, that was primarily fought with volunteers who were raised. It wasn't fought by a large permanent army. I mean, the kind of Republicans, that is small r Republicans, who were creating an America as a republic, were very concerned about standing armies. They didn't want to have a huge one. They understood the temptation that was. I mean, you have think of Madeleine Albright, her comment to Colin Powell back when she was UN, or I guess Secretary of State at the time, or UN ambassador, was, what's the use of having this wonderful military you keep talking about if we don't use it, right? We have it. This is fabulous. Let's use it. A fabulous tool. So for her, American soldiers were kind of, gambit pawns in some global chess game that she wanted to go play. Colin Powell, to his credit, is somebody who'd served in Vietnam with people who died. He understood that war isn't a game. And I think the founders very, very much understood that. I mean, the country together for the war, a lot of people died, a lot of hardship. They didn't want that unnecessarily. And until the Spanish-American War, I mean, America essentially fought on the continent and expanded continentally. But it wasn't until the Spanish-American War that we wandered off overseas. I mean, we ended up killing a couple 100,000 Filipinos because we'd taken the Philippines, and I guess we can't turn them over to somebody else, and they certainly aren't eligible self-government, so we've got to do this. I mean, extraordinary. How we went from the revolution, and then 100 years later, we were subjugating people who wanted to be free. That was a massive transformation. And then World War I, of course, Woodrow Wilson brought us back into the old world and turned us into an imperial power, which is very tragic. But yeah, I mean, I think Americans have lost sight of that what we do today just seems natural. This idea of, American exceptionalism. We're anointed, from God to go wandering around the world killing people for their own good, of course. And that was never the vision of the Americans originally. I mean, it was the idea of you be a light upon, you're going to be the famous city upon a hill. You're going to be the light, for the nations. You're going to lead by example, protect yourself, have good relations with people, but you certainly don't wander around the world going to war.
Yeah, you mentioned sanctions. I think that's an important instrument that we ought to talk a little bit about. We're not talking about violent war here, but I consider sanctions to be an act of war because you're really targeting the innocent civilians of a country with death in the hopes of achieving either regime change or compliance of their government with our orders or our government's orders. And these things have been brutal. I mean, if you look at the Iraq sanctions where they killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children, you've got Madeleine Albright's infamous statement that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions were worth it. You've got the sanctions in Iran, which have been horrific, and then combined with the coronavirus crisis, have just been horrendous in terms of death toll and infection. Would you comment a little bit about your reaction to these sanctions as a tool of foreign policy?
Yeah, sanctions historically have been viewed as an act of war. They can certainly be treated that way. I mean, what they've become is kind of the cheap way for the U.S. to intervene. Nobody wants to go to war. Nobody wants to lose soldiers. So you say, okay, we got to do something. And what's really changed, I think, is that today Congress, as well as the administration, are really into sanctions. I mean, we essentially have 535 people on Capitol Hill. Not quite, there are at least a half dozen non-interventionists, I suppose, in Congress. But we have, several hundred would-be secretaries of state on Capitol Hill who want to do something. And very often they want to do something, and I understand. I mean, there are a lot of bad countries around the world. But what they come up with is sanctions. And you're absolutely right. I mean, sanctions basically target an entire population. They've come up recently with targeted sanctions, which, sound nice but don't do any good. I mean, they've sanctioned the party head of Xinjiang, the province where Uyghurs are being oppressed. Does anybody imagine he's going to run into Xi Jinping's office and say, oh my goodness, I can't go to Disneyland in America. Let's democratize. I mean, it has no impact. It just makes them, congressmen feel good because they passed something. The problem is the widespread sanctions, are devastating to populations. I mean, who profits from this? Well, it's the elite. It's the government. Did anybody say without a media sanction? We're sanctioning now Syria for the express purpose of preventing them from reconstructing after a 9-year civil war. So we imagine that Bashar Assad, who's won the civil war, gone through 9 years of hideous combat, is now going to say, "Oh my goodness, I guess I should give up because they're punishing my people." Excuse me? What evidence is there that he cares about his people? He can just go to them and say it's the Americans who won't let us, reconstruct Venezuela. I mean, again, we're sanctioning a desperately poor country, making their hardship even worse, as if this is going to make Mr. Maduro go away. I mean, this is an insane policy. And what we've done is we no longer just sanction, kind of say Americans cannot trade. We use the U.S. financial system to conscript the rest of the world. So we punish any company anywhere if it deals with an American financial system in some way, which most of them do, and then they deal with Syria, or they deal with Iran, or they deal with Cuba, or they deal with Venezuela or North Korea. I mean, and we're doing a fair amount, though not quite as far, with Russia and some other countries. It's an extraordinarily punitive policy that hurts those who are most at risk, and it never works. To me, this is the extraordinary thing. Trump ratcheted up sanctions on all these countries. Not one of them has given in, not one. And so, American policymakers keep saying, well, we just have to do a little more. They're putting more sanctions on Iran to make it harder for Biden to try to step away from that. Well, how does that help anybody? It won't change the Iranian policy. And indeed, sanctions, tell other regimes they should arm themselves. They tell you why the U.S. is dangerous. Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons and missiles, or his nuclear program and missiles, and we took him out when he was vulnerable. And we've sent a message to the world that you can't trust the U.S., and if you disarm, we'll take you out. Sanctions are part of that. I mean, any country facing U.S. military threats and sanctions is going to tell itself, we need nukes, we need good weapons. You can't trust these people.
Yeah, that's a great point. Richard?
Well, I just want to I want to play devil's advocate here, because there are issues that come up between some libertarians, and certainly between libertarians and conservatives. And that is, it's all very well and good, it is said, to talk about the original founding principles, George Washington's farewell address, John Quincy Adams' 4th of July address. We live in a different world, and we are a closely knit world in which other nations attempt themselves to be great powers. That clearly Xi Jinping wants to make China great again, to use a phrase. He has claimed a huge swath of the South China Sea and made these artificial islands, which are being militarized. He's following an imperialist path and making governmental loans to countries in other parts of Asia or Africa, and then ending up playing them in a way that these countries have to become dependent or even have to cede territory. I mean, now they're playing colonial military base abroad in various countries, such as Sri Lanka. And that they are building up their military, not just land, but also sea. And unless America takes a leadership role, because can Vietnam alone stand up to China? Can Philippines alone stand up to China? Can Malaysia alone stand up to China, or so on? That unless America plays a leadership role in what can be a dangerous world, where a nation that does not have even the semblance of the philosophical history of our own wants to dominate and overreach itself, it will affect America in negative ways. Are we to supposedly just ignore this and sit back and say, well, it's not our concern? These are arguments that are made, Doug.
Of course. Look, I think we have to recognize we're the dominant power on Earth. Almost everything on Earth in some way concerns us. Rarely does it concern vital interests, and rarely does it require war. To me, that's the critical issue here, is to recognize sometimes things happen in the world that aren't good. Is it our job to try to fix everything? China is going to be a real challenge, but it's very important to recognize. First is China is no superpower. China remains poor. The fact that it has a much larger population, its per capita GDP is well below ours. It has massive differences in income distribution, which cause political problems internally. It's got a massive problem on demography. The one-child policy, though repealed, has created a country that's shrinking. By the end of this century, if current demographic trends continue, its population will be something like 440 million. I mean, this is a country that has an rapidly aging population where culturally you're supposed to take care of your parents and grandparents. Well, that's a real problem. There aren't enough women. That's a real social problem within. This is a country that's economy is still quite statist, massive problems on debts, bad banks. And the political situation, Xi Jinping is on the mountaintop, but I think he's also on the precipice. He's made a lot of enemies. And he's created a country where independent thought is being squeezed out. That's going to have an impact on economics and everything else. So I think it's important first is to recognize we've got a problem here, but this is not an 800-pound gorilla. Second thing is it won't necessarily last. Look back, Mao Zedong died in 1976. He's succeeded by Deng Xiaoping, and the country reformed. It changed. Until Xi took over, this was a loose authoritarian system. It was nasty, but if you were careful, if you didn't attack the Communist Party directly, there was a fair amount of looseness in it. Cato worked with free market think tanks there. They've been shut down. Unirule Institute, for example, was shut down last year. I went by their office before they got shut down. I was in China. And, they've been pushed around. Their executive director no longer could travel. We saw the writing on the wall. But the point is, this could change back. So I think that's the first point. The second point is to realize militarily what it's doing is what we've done in the sense of it wants a Monroe Doctrine for itself. So the question for us is, are we prepared to undertake the cost and risk of projecting power in East Asia along their border? And how much are we willing to spend to do that? That's the real problem. Projecting that power costs an awful lot. And are we prepared for war on that? And I tell people, imagine if the Chinese Navy was sailing up the East Coast, China sent its Navy into the Caribbean, China told us what it expected in terms of U.S. policy towards Cuba. People in Washington wouldn't be saying, oh, I guess that's okay, they're nice people. They'd be saying, build stuff. We have to take these people out. We have to be able to sink their Navy. We have to be able to protect ourselves. So my reaction is what we want in Asia is other countries to work together to help defend themselves. China has a potent force, but because we're there, they spend 1% of GDP on the military. We spend 4%. Why are we spending money to defend them when they could spend the money themselves? Philippines now wants Japan to do more. Countries in Southeast Asia are working with India. I mean, there's a lot of good going on because they feel threatened by China. And to me, this is the long-term answer. And I'm happy we can play a leader if that means helping them cooperate, encouraging them to work together, finding ways to help them step back from ancient hatreds. But the point is, China's not in a very good geographic position. The U.S. is in a fabulous position. China is surrounded by countries with which it's been at war. Russia, Korea, Japan, India, Vietnam, and none of those countries really like it. The main thing I would advocate is let's end our stupid policy of punishing Russia and encourage them to work with the West as opposed to work with China. We don't want an alliance between Russia and China. Well, we've got to stop punishing them. They work together because they hate us more. That's something that we can change. We want to rejigger the balance of power. That means encouraging others to take on that responsibility. It doesn't mean we have to do it ourselves.
Doug, you've written a lot about the virtues of free trade as well. And in the waning moments here, would you tell us a little bit about your perspective on trade, especially in the context of foreign policy?
Look, I mean, trade, there's no doubt that trade benefits both sides. I mean, trade that is voluntary, not trade that's managed, not trade where we insist they buy stuff or we buy stuff. Trade, it's free people. It's kind of consenting acts. It's, capitalist acts among consenting adults. I mean, the point is you trade because both sides are better off. Without question, that has helped us grow prosperous. It's helped other countries. It's had a dramatic impact on poor countries, bringing them into the international trading system, having them adopt markets has transformed. Look at East Asian countries. The big difference between, say, an Argentina that was one of the world's richest countries back after the end of World War II, compared to South Korea that was one of the poorest, all the Asian countries have rapidly moved ahead. They engaged the world. They engaged in free trade. We should want that. And it's one thing, when you think about China, people are saying, oh, it failed. They're not democratic. My answer is no. Some of us may have hoped for too much. But number one is, a 500 million people in China have been raised out of immiserating poverty. That's a good thing. And we should like that. We should think that's wonderful. To me, if babies there are no longer dying, that's a very good thing. Free trade, market reforms are what have done that. And that is extraordinarily important. We see that in Bangladesh. We see that in a lot of poor countries. Africa, there's been a bit of a renaissance, greater engagement with the international trading system. So we should want that. And this is something that benefits both sides, and we have to fight for this. I mean, it's interesting. Under Trump, with his protectionist policies, more Americans than ever see the virtues of free trade. We need to build on that, and we have to work. We're going to have to be active on this because the Democrats have moved more protectionist. It's hard to imagine Biden could be worse than Trump on this issue, but there's no guarantee he's going to be much better. The American people have to speak out on this and say we benefit. And over the long term, this is a way to help transform other countries. I mean, again, there's no guarantee. It doesn't mean China becomes democratic, but there are a lot of people in China who like freedom. Students love freedom. They're nationalists. And that's why things like Taiwan are very dangerous. They believe they should control Taiwan and they don't care about anything else. But they also don't like censorship. They like freedom. They don't want to be ordered around. Free trade does that. Chinese students have all the gadgets of the West that we have. They want to be like Westerners in many ways. They want to, have the same freedoms in many ways. And that helps. Free trade helps deliver that, and it delivers it elsewhere as well.
Okay, well, we're about out of time. You've published some books through Cato, which is at cato.org. Want to mention some of the books that you recommend people get?
I have one that I did columns on, foreign follies, and I'm working with antiwar.com to do another one. We're going to do an online, a kind of a Kindle book of columns that I have on foreign policy. So that's something I'd hopefully look forward to. I just have to find the time to kind of put that all together. Of course, you all are kind enough to run a number of my articles. I do a regular column for antiwar.com, actually a week. I do a regular column for American Conservative. I write a lot for National Interest. Cato, puts my stuff up as well. So go to cato.org. It's not just me. We have some other good people there looking at some of these issues, trying to promote peace at a time of war. I encourage, everybody who is involved with FFF needs to be involved. There's a lot of folks on the other side in Washington. It's filled with wannabe warriors. I mean, the sofa samurai. It's filled with people who want to run the world, be global social engineers. We need American people in there speaking and saying, we don't need that. We want peace. We want freedom. We want prosperity. We wanted the American government to deliver what it promised when it was created. We don't want to turn it into something like China to try to dominate the world.
Yeah, no, the work that you guys, Ted Galen Carpenter at Cato and others there have done has been heroic. And let's face it, ideas have consequences. Why do we do what we do? Because this is the way out of this morass that the Trump, Biden, conservatives, liberals, progressives have led our nation. There's a way out of this, and that's through what we're talking about here.
And if not us, who, right? I mean, we have this. We really do have to do this.
Yeah, we're the light shining through the darkness.
Exactly.
Okay, on that note, we'll wrap things up. Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the conversation with you, and thank you, Doug. This has been great. Really appreciate your time.
Great to dialogue with both of you. It's always fun. So much to do.
Yep. Richard, see you next week.
Until next time. Thank you, Doug.
Take care. Bye-bye.